Foreign policy includes climate change. National security includes climate change. Climate change is not entirely an environmental issue, it's a national security issue. Here's why. Historically, wars and instability have been driven by things like famines and droughts, lack of food, lack of where people can live. And there are various estimates. I Googled it this morning. The estimates are 100 to 300 million climate refugees in the next 40 years. Just to put it in perspective, the number of refugees from Syria, which has destabilized Europe and certainly involved itself in our politics, is like 2 million. 100 million. Imagine the impact of that. Where are those people going to go? They're mostly going to come from around the center of the earth where the temperature is going to be unbearable or where there are droughts and famines, and they're going to be headed north. We're facing about a foot of sea level rise in the next 15 years and a foot a decade thereafter for the rest of the century. That's why I believe Paris was so important, and I'm very much hoping that the administration will not back away from Paris, because it would unravel what is a promising, not a definitive, but a promising international recognition of the danger of this issue to all of us. And its mission is to be the communications link between the president and our nuclear forces in case of a nuclear attack. One person has that decision. We all think of our government as being this sort of herky-jerky checks and balances, Congress, the Supreme Court, the House, the Senate. No. In this situation, no checks and balances, no Congress, no Supreme Court, one person making the decision, and that person is probably in a helicopter being evacuated from Washington. There is no substitute for judgment and leadership in that moment. And that's something that we all need to understand. Now, the second part of this story is there are places for Congress to have a role in foreign policy, which they have mostly abdicated. The Constitution, it's really interesting. If you go back to the debates in the Constitutional Convention, in Madison's notes, they ended up splitting it. The president is the commander-in-chief, but the Congress declares war. That was the pretty straightforward separation of the authority, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. The Congress decides whether we should commit the country, and then the president executes the war, because you can't run a war by committee. The problem is Congress hasn't declared war since 1942. Congress doesn't want to take this responsibility of making these decisions. And right now we're in this debate about Syria, and my position is we should have that debate. The president and the administration should define the strategy, but they should come to Congress and say, we need an authorization. Otherwise, we just slide into these things, and right now we're operating on an authorization that was passed 8 days after September 11th. But I believe that's a responsibility that Congress has, and that's going to be a debate that we're going to be having over the next several weeks. The great champion of this in the Congress right now is Tim Kaine of Virginia. That it's the situation in those countries that's so desperate that's creating this immigration crisis that we have at the southern border. That's why cutting the budget of the State Department makes no sense. It's a huge mistake to be cutting AID and the programs that are trying to make life more tolerable in these various difficult places around the world. General Mattis, who's now the head of the Defense Department, a couple of years ago when he was in the Joint Chiefs, or I think he was CENTCOM commander, said, if you cut money for the State Department, you're going to have to give me more money for bullets. You know, and the other thing about, they're talking about defunding the National Endowment for the Arts and public broadcasting, and, you know, they're nothing in terms of the overall federal budget. I mean, it's just, it's symbolism, and I think would be an impoverishment to the country. That's why it's so important that this be dealt with on a bipartisan basis, not as a partisan fight, but as something that is that we can do to protect ourselves as a society, because they're going to keep doing it. The part of what they did that really worries me, that's gotten the least publicity, is they probed into our state election systems, registration systems, voting systems. They, as near as anybody can tell, they were unsuccessful. They couldn't change votes, fine. But they weren't doing it for fun. The Paris Accords are really a beginning, not a regulatory regime, but just a commitment by countries around the world. And the important thing is India and China signed on. And to unravel that, I think, would be a big mistake that we're going to have to pay for.
The United States is actively selling arms, refueling jets used by the Saudi coalition, providing them intelligence. But the United Nations has identified destruction of infrastructure for moving food and humanitarian assistance around Yemen and deliberate blockage of movement by the coalition as the main cause in a famine that could kill 7 million people. Could you please clarify your position on U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, specifically further arms sales to Saudi Arabia and President Trump's proposal for direct U.S. participation in the Saudi-led coalition?
I think it's a mistake. I think, again, it's another extremely complex, as you know, Al-Qaeda's there, the Houthis, Saudi Arabia, and I think we need to really have deep thought before we get further engaged, and I think we should have a review of our current policy, because we can't be complicit. And that's I think, we can't avoid our responsibility by saying, well, we don't know where that jet fuel went. And I think that's a role that we have to play. Now, again, you focus on the Yemeni problem, but then you say, okay, but we need the Saudis' help with ISIS in northern Iraq, and that's why it really that's how it starts to get more complicated. It's the same thing as, the Russians, if we could work with them to get rid of Assad, and then they could help us with ISIS, that would, and so it's impossible to say that they're always my enemy or always my friend. But I do think that the role that we're playing in Yemen is due for some serious review. Thank you. And there are a couple of answers. One is deterrence has worked for 75 years. There hasn't been a use of a nuclear weapon since Hiroshima. And it's mostly been because of the deterrence and people on both sides knowing what the awful consequences would be. The problem is deterrence presumes rational actors on both sides. And the question is whether Kim Jong-un is a rational actor. Now, I can tell you what I've learned from the intelligence community is they believe that he is. That he may be volatile and unpredictable, but he's not crazy. And that he understands the concept of national suicide. So I think deterrence can have an impact. The problem is, and again, we've got to try to think like him. He sees this as the key to his survival of his regime and international prestige, etc. He's not going to give in to threats from us, I don't think. The path to solving North Korea, in my view, runs through China. China is North Korea's patron. And without China, North Korea would be unable to survive, in what I understand, in terms of their economy. So China is now weighing. China's not happy with what's going on, in my understanding. But they also don't want to see the regime fall and South Korea take over, and they have a Western ally right on their border. So they're sort of weighing that. At some point, they're going to have to decide the danger outweighs the danger of greater liberalization, if you will, of North Korea. Here's one of the other complicating factors. I started by talking about how complicated things are. Seoul, Korea is closer to the border of North Korea than we are to Bangor. It's 40 miles. The North Koreans could take out Seoul, 15 million people, with just artillery. They don't need missiles, rockets, or an army. I'm really worried about a misunderstanding. The example I used was, we're moving an aircraft carrier. We view that as a show of force. What if he views it as an incipient attack and he has to respond? Then you see you've got a very, very dangerous situation, because if there's an attack on that aircraft carrier, then there's an escalation on their side. No question, this is one of the most dangerous situations that we've faced possibly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. On that happy note.